Well, good morning and welcome back to the channel, folks. You may not necessarily know it in your neck of the woods, but where I am right now, it is very early in the morning. The sun hasn't even come up, and this morning we're going to be talking about drawing Courtney at the Hard Yacht Cafe. Let's get into it. Okay, so I've taken our reference drawing and kind of tucked it up in the upper left-hand corner there so we can see the inspiration behind the caricature that we're going to be drawing. The subject name here is Courtney. Courtney was kind enough to allow me to take a few photographs of her while she was working as a bartender at a local bar called the Hard Yacht Cafe. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. In the meantime, let's just kind of focus on the photograph that we have here because the picture-in-picture feature of the editing software I'm using isn't going to allow this photo to stay up for very long. So I thought we'd just focus on the formation of the drawing really quick before we talk about anything else. So, to get right to it, Courtney has a face that's very much accentuated by the hairstyle that she chooses to wear. I drew a picture of another bartender at this bar recently and posted it, and they both have very similar hairstyle where parts of their head are shaved and the dreadlocks are the main kind of grouping of the hair there. I took some very unique approaches to how this was rendered, but again, I'll get into that a little bit later. For now, let's focus on the caricature drawing and the choices that were made in the formation of this caricature. And what it comes down to here is choosing that thing that makes Courtney a little bit unique in terms of her face or her shape. And what I chose to go with here, amongst a couple of other choices, was to really kind of accentuate the roundness of her head. The shaved portion of her head really kind of lends itself to kind of seeing just how round the top of her skull is and how dainty her cheek and her lower jaw is by comparison. And so when I decided to create some sort of a drawing loosely based on her features, the thing that kind of stood out to me more than just about anything else was the final shape that her skull or her head was going to take. Now, this isn't really unusual to my technique. There are a lot of different ways to draw caricatures, and there's a lot of different ways that Courtney could be drawn here, but the method that I chose to take, or the choice I chose to make, is to emphasize her head shape more than anything else. She has some other distinct features, like the way that her smile has some relatively thin lips, and her teeth show, or the size of her eyes, and the large earring that she has in her ear there. All these things are again ripe for exaggeration if somebody wanted to make those choices. But the head shape is the thing that kind of try to dial in, and again, it's a choice I make quite a bit when it comes to the style that I choose to work in when I work in caricatures. Now, accuracy for resemblance is essential too. So not only am I kind of trying to nail in that head shape, but once I've done that, I am taking the time to make sure that the shape of her mouth matches the shape of her picture. And again, you can notice the picture-in-picture has kind of disappeared here, so we're going to have to kind of go off memory for the rest of this, just because, again, the editing software doesn't allow me to hold that picture-in-picture for very long. But we do have a good resemblance of Courtney achieved here, and that resemblance is not only just in the shape of the head, but it's also in making sure that the other features are as photo accurate as you can get them to be. And a great example of this would be the mouth. There's a very popular school of thought out there that says that if you can get the mouth right, it doesn't matter what else you draw, the resemblance is there. And the reasoning behind that is that when we look at people, when we talk at people, we tend to look at their mouths so we can see, to a certain degree, read lips as we're having conversation. So focusing on Courtney's mouth and trying to get her smile just right was also a really kind of an important thing to this, although I try to get as much accuracy as I can on every of the particular significant aspects of the face. I spend time on the nose, I spend time on the eyes, et cetera, but the mouth was something that you really want to make sure that you get right. And I intend to focus on teeth when it comes to this as well. So, it's not just good enough to draw a bunch of lines in and assume that just represents somebody's smile. Going in there and showing a little bit of gum, if that's what shows up in your photograph, or showing a gap, where the teeth are open and the tongue is sticking out, if that's what you see in your photograph. These are the things, again, that bring it back to capturing that resemblance. People have very unique smiles, and even if they're not smiling, mouths tend to be very unique with thin and thick lips and whether a mouth naturally stays open or stays closed. So going in and trying to kind of hone in that resemblance there is also a good technique as well. Now, let's shift gears here a little bit and talk a little bit about Courtney's narrative, so to speak. The photograph that we had of her was just her standing there looking in the camera. There was nothing all that engaging about it per se. So when it comes time to draw the picture and get some sort of a interesting element in there, I like to make sure that I'm drawing some sort of a narrative. And when I say narrative, mind you, I'm talking about a little bit of storytelling, but nothing that really involves some sort of a complex plot or anything like that. I don't need it. I'm just trying to make sure that Courtney's doing something so we have some interest on the page. Something that tells the suggestion of a story rather than a full story story itself. And what is it? Simply put, she's just pouring some bottles, pouring some liquor. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but at least she's doing something to give it some, dynamic sense of interest, if that makes sense. So you can see here I've roughly kind of sketched out this idea that she's going to be pouring a shot, and my original idea was that the narrative was going to be she was going to pour a shot, but the shot was overflowing and spilling over the edge of the glass onto the table. I changed my mind on this a little bit later. I found some reference photographs on bartenders holding bottles that I thought were really compelling, and I'll again speak into that when we get to that part of the drawing a little bit later on. But in the meantime, what we're looking at here is the honing aspect of the drawing. Now I'm still working in what might loosely be called a digital pencil. I'm not on my final inks yet, but I am really trying to make sure that my final shapes are taking place here, and more than anything else, that if I've got a resemblance, that I'm holding on to it and honing it rather than moving away from it as I start making final line work commit, and get a sense of what this is going to look like when it's three-dimensional. Because what I'm also doing is I'm getting some sense of shading putting in here in a couple of areas. Means of example here would be the bridge of the nose. If you notice, I put some light shadow in there, even though that's not going to be represented in my final inks, just to get an idea of where those shadows are going to be and see if that three-dimensional rendering is still holding onto the resemblance that I'm trying for here. Now you can see what I'm doing with the hand at this point. We can go back and visit that. This is a very unusual position for a hand to take, but I did get it off a reference photograph of a bartender holding two bottles in the same exact fashion you see there in the drawing. Now, I don't have the reference photo available. Again, I told you about the wonkiness of the picture-in-picture that's available here, so you'll just kind of have to take my word for it. But the reality here is that this is not an unusual thing to see bartenders do if they're trying to get a little bit fancy. So holding two bottles at once, pouring both liquors at the same time, and getting a hand that looks like it can actually physically and realistically do this was something of a challenge. But again, I attribute all the ability to kind of capture this in the reference photograph that I used for it. What's really handy here is that I've been practicing drawing hands quite a bit lately, so the ability to kind of draw just fingers and not the whole hand actually made things a little bit easier for me. So let's go ahead and talk about how we render the bottles then. Now, the reality here is that I didn't want to spend a lot of time rendering bottles. I knew that I wanted to render a face, and that was where I wanted to focus the attention. So did I want to spend all day rendering a tiny little half of a Captain Morgan on a bottle? No. So the easiest way to do it was to just go online, find pictures of these bottles, cut out the labels, and then just kind of paste them in place where I needed them. I still wanted to render the bottles themselves. I wanted to render the notion of glass and the reflective surface of that glass when I got to the shadows and highlight portion a little bit later on. But the labels I figured I could get away with, and the same process was used to kind of render some sort of a background. What I did was I found a picture of the bar that Courtney works at and just blew it up really big and just made it really, really fuzzy, so there wasn't any discernible objects or people in the background, just something that kind of said that she was in a physical space that looked vaguely like a bar. And the funny thing is that it is actually the bar she works at, but it's almost completely unrecognizable by the way that I blurred it. And, in order to make sure that it was a little bit easier to kind of get some of the color study done on her face, I hid that layer for a while, so that way it was, mostly because it was just so busy and so colorful that it was distracting from the color and light work that I was trying to do with the actual rendering. So again, hiding it for a little while made sense. You'll see the blurriness of it a little bit later on, but it's just not meant to draw your attention. That's kind of the point. Now, as we get into this coloring phase here, things are going to speed up quite a bit. I tend to slow down the drawing aspect and speed up the coloring aspect because I have a lot of videos I've done in the past about how the coloring and the light and the shadows are rendered, at least in the technique that I use. Now, in interest of full disclosure here, I'll let you know that I haven't been doing a lot of these drawings lately, and it's mostly because I just kind of feel like a little bit spent on the subject matter. The truth of the matter here is I'm actually studying some new and different styles of caricature, and I'm thinking about kind of changing up the technique a little bit. So this may be the last video of this style that you see for a little while. I'm going to be working on some different techniques and some different skills and practicing on that sort of thing in the future. So it also may prevent me from posting a whole lot of videos in such a frequent pace in the near future as well. But having said that, I'll say that we're getting close to kind of our end phase here. And as we get towards the end phase, you can see that when I did with the hair here was a little bit different than what I did with the rest of the flesh tones. I basically kind of painted in the hair using just specific paint brushes rather than draw and fill in and try to produce some rendering afterwards. The paintbrush effect gives hair a nice texture, and with Courtney's having this kind of dreaded, kind of shaggy hair kind of look to her, with multiple colors going through it as well, I thought that this was kind of a good way to kind of get that sense of hair and the texture of hair in there. And I think it was a particularly effective one, considering you don't see a whole lot of hair in her head. But the parts that you do see, it at least have some genuine feel of hair to them. One other thing to add in here is that Courtney has a lot of tattoos on her arms. She was kind enough to let me take some photographs of just the tattoos. I'm not going to show those to you, but it did allow me to get some sense of accuracy in there. And if it wasn't said before, I'll put it out there. This bar is in Maryland and Baltimore, and that's the theme of the tattoos that she has in her arm. So here's kind of the final product. A lot of rendering done there, but again, I think I explained most of it. Here's our original origin picture, and I thought what we'd do is just a stage by stage on how we got to final product. So we start with a photo, we get our rough sketch laid in, something kind of helps us approach some composition. We tighten up that rough sketch a little bit, kind of get it nice and solid, and then ink. Notice the hair isn't present in the ink, that gets painted in separately. Then we get in our bottles, their labels, get our base colors in, and then bring in all the special effects with the light and shadow, background, etc. to our finished piece. So that's all there is to it. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments, and I'll be back soon with more videos. Thanks for stopping by.